For centuries, readers and scholars have struggled with four of the strangest verses in Genesis. They describe beings called the sons of God crossing into the human world, and a race called the Nephilim born from that union. And immediately after, God decides the earth must be destroyed. Most modern readings move past this connection quickly, treating it as a strange detour before the real story begins. But the passage has never stopped generating debate, and once you slow down enough to see why, the flood stops looking like a footnote and starts looking like the consequence of something the church rarely spends much time explaining. Who were these beings? Why does their story sit directly between creation and catastrophe? And why has this passage remained one of the most argued over in the entire Hebrew Bible? The answer starts with a single Hebrew phrase, one that shows up in only a handful of places in Scripture, and every time it does, the ground shifts a little. The world before the flood was already breaking apart. The story does not begin with judgment. It begins quietly, almost administratively. Humanity multiplying, daughters being born, the ordinary business of a growing world. Then, without warning, Genesis introduces a second category of being entirely. The sons of God see the daughters of men. They find them beautiful. They take them. And immediately after that sentence, God places a limit on human life itself. Something shifted in that moment, and Genesis does not explain what. It gives us 4 verses and then moves directly toward devastation. The earth corrupt, violence filling it, and a flood that undoes almost everything. The compression itself has fascinated readers for generations. A text this careful rarely lingers on something unimportant, and scholars have long debated exactly how these 4 verses connect to the judgment that follows. Who were the sons of God? This is where the mystery sharpens. The Hebrew phrase is B'nai Ha-Elohim, sons of God, or, more literally, sons of the divine realm. That same expression appears in the book of Job, used there for beings who stand in the presence of God before the world was even formed. That parallel is one of the strongest reasons many interpreters read Genesis 6 as describing supernatural beings rather than ordinary men. Not everyone reads it that way. For centuries, one explanation has dominated many pulpits, the Sethite interpretation, which holds that the sons of God were simply the righteous descendants of Seth, marrying into the corrupted line of Cain. It is the more comfortable reading. It keeps angels out of the story entirely. But it runs into a problem the supernatural reading does not. Nothing elsewhere in Scripture uses sons of God for a righteous human bloodline, and the phrase's use in Job points somewhere else entirely. The supernatural interpretation is extremely ancient, and it appears prominently in early Jewish interpretation, long before later theologians began looking for a way around it. The forbidden union. Strip away the centuries of careful softening, and the scene itself is stark. Beings from the divine realm crossing into the human world, taking wives, producing offspring. Whatever else this passage is doing, it is describing a boundary being crossed. The same boundary Genesis spends its opening chapters carefully constructing between heaven, earth, and the order that holds them apart. It reads less like romance and more like trespass, told in language calm enough to survive 1,000 readings, without most people stopping to ask what it actually implies. And Genesis does not treat this crossing as neutral. It sits the episode immediately before the announcement of judgment, close enough that the two feel connected, even though the text never spells out exactly how. Then it gives the result of that union a name. Then came the Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 names them, the Nephilim, described alongside the sons of God and the daughters of men, called mighty men, men of renown. Later tradition renders the name as giants. Some scholars connect the word to a Hebrew root meaning to fall, suggesting the fallen ones, though the exact etymology remains genuinely disputed among linguists, and no reading has settled the question completely. The name resurfaces long after the flood, in Numbers 13:33, when Israelite spies return from Canaan describing Nephilim still walking the land, so imposing that the spies say they felt like grasshoppers standing beside them. That single verse creates a real chronological problem. If the flood was meant to end every line the Nephilim came from, how does the name reappear generations later, describing people who were apparently still there? Genesis never resolves it. Numbers simply reports it as fact and moves on, leaving the puzzle for everyone who came after to untangle. Later Jewish tradition tried. Some writings connect Og, king of Bashan, to that same ancient line. Deuteronomy describes his bed in dimensions large enough that the text seems to want you to notice. But that connection between Og and the Nephilim is later interpretation and tradition, not something Genesis or Deuteronomy states outright. It's a thread later readers picked up, not a chain the text hands you directly. The Watchers, what Genesis leaves out, and 1st Enoch fills in. Genesis gives 4 verses. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish work whose complete text survives in Ethiopic manuscripts, expands this small passage into an elaborate story of heavenly watchers. There, the sons of God become 200 rebellious beings under a leader named Shemihazah, who descend to Mount Hermon and bind themselves by oath to a plan the text frames as forbidden from its very first line. In Enoch's account, the Watchers do more than take wives. They teach. Weapon forging, the reading of the stars, incantations, and the art of cosmetics used to seduce. Forbidden knowledge placed into human hands before humanity was ready to hold it responsibly. It's worth being precise about where this comes from. This expanded material belongs to 1st Enoch, not to Genesis itself. Genesis stays narrow. It names only corruption and violence as the cause of judgment. The forbidden knowledge narrative is 1st Enoch's contribution, layered on top centuries later. Although 1st Enoch influenced ancient Jewish and early Christian thought, the New Testament book of Jude even quotes it directly, it was not included in the biblical canon of most Christian traditions, as that canon took shape. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church remains a notable exception, preserving Enoch as scripture to this day. Why do Peter and Jude mention sinning angels? The New Testament seems to reach back toward this same territory. 2 Peter describes God confining angels who sinned, holding them for judgment. Jude speaks of angels who did not keep their proper domain and were bound in darkness, awaiting the great day. Many interpreters connect these verses to the Watchers tradition surrounding Genesis 6, and Jude's use of Enochic material makes the connection especially hard to dismiss. But it remains an interpretive link, not a passage where either author explicitly says, "This is what Genesis 6 means." The mystery survives even inside the New Testament's own pages. Why was Noah different? Against all of this, one figure stands apart. Genesis calls Noah Tamim, a word meaning blameless, whole, a man of integrity. It's tempting to read that word as something more literal, untouched, unmixed, biologically set apart from whatever had spread through the world around him. But the text doesn't make that claim. What Genesis actually emphasizes is moral contrast. The earth had become corrupt, and Noah walked with God anyway. That contrast, not a hidden claim about bloodlines, is what the word is doing. The real reason God sends the flood. And here the pieces come together, carefully. Genesis is specific about its cause. The earth was corrupt, and violence had filled it. That is the stated reason. stated twice, in language that does not require angels or giants to make sense on its own. The sons of God and the Nephilim sit in the background of that story, part of the world sliding toward ruin. But Genesis itself never draws a straight line from divine beings crossed a boundary to therefore the flood. That connection is one later readers have drawn for centuries, a reasonable one given how closely the passages sit together, but an inference, not a stated fact. The modern mirror. The analogy is tempting and worth exploring carefully rather than asserting outright. Today, laboratories edit the human genome directly. Artificial intelligence performs tasks once thought to belong only to the human mind. Researchers speak openly about merging biology with machine, about extending life indefinitely, about becoming something more than what we were made to be. The tools are entirely different from anything in Genesis. But the ancient story raises a question that hasn't aged at all. What happens when the ability to reshape ourselves outpaces the wisdom to know whether we should? Genesis doesn't answer that question for the modern world. It isn't describing genetic engineering or artificial intelligence, but it does leave behind a warning shaped exactly like one. Final revelation. So, why did God send the flood? Genesis is more direct about this than the later legends suggest. The earth had become corrupt, violence had filled it, and humanity had drifted from the order it was meant to live inside. The sons of God, the Nephilim, the Watchers of later tradition, all of it sits around that central claim, expanding it, dramatizing it, and in some cases speculating well beyond what the text itself says. What's left, underneath centuries of expansion and disagreement, is a shorter and more uncomfortable question than any giant or fallen angel. What does a world look like right before it crosses a line it cannot come back from? And how would we know if we were standing inside it right now, rather than reading about it 3,000 years later?